AI is not actually thinking. It's not actually really understanding what you're saying. It's just taking the words that you gave it and predicting what's most likely to come next. And when you say act as an expert marketer, you're kind of like giving it better context to then go predict from. And so you're going to get kind of better responses.
Let's go. All right. Welcome to the Pubcast. I'm your host, John Loomer, and we have a really special episode today. As we're going to be spending time with someone who is an expert in the AI field. And as we know, this has been an important topic for all of us. I mean, marketers, Facebook advertisers, just really across the board ever since this ChatGPT business has come about. And to the point where Luke and I have discussed it on a prior episode of the Pubcast. I've been covering it to the best of my ability in some blog posts and videos, but I know I'm just scratching the surface. But Luke is back with me today to interview this special guest. You may have seen her on TikTok covering tips for AI. I've been following her very closely, trying to stay up to date what's going on. She does a really good job of breaking this stuff down for the rest of us who aren't experts in AI and ChatGPT to know what's going on. And she's the founder of AI Exchange, Rachel Woods. How you doing, Rachel? Welcome.
I'm good. Thanks. Thanks so much for having me. I'm yeah, excited for this conversation.
Awesome. So uh, much of our content is actually related to Meta and Meta advertising, and now we realize how big of a topic this is, and we got to start understanding, okay, how can we leverage this, for what we're doing. Now, I understand you have a bit of a history with Meta as well.
I do. I worked at Facebook when it was called Facebook. That's what I
Yeah.
like to say.
Awesome. So what's your background there? And if you could just share, how did you end up doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, so thanks again for having me. Really
Yeah.
excited to chat with you guys. I actually started my career in marketing, which is fun. So here amongst friends in that regard. And then I basically got kind of had quite romantic thoughts about, oh, it'd be really cool to be a marketer who coded.
Mm.
Went and taught myself enough coding to get a job at Facebook. Ended up on this really interesting team, which was a like research data science team where we would basically listen to the machine learning PhDs and what they were figuring out with like the latest kind of breakthroughs in AI and ML. And then we would figure out how you actually go and apply that into the product. So some of the tools that you guys might have used in Facebook's ad manager, like creative fatigue and audience
Oh,
overlap, actually stuff that I worked on.
you know that stuff has gone away, right?
I have not been keeping up to date with this stuff as
Yeah,
much, but yeah,
It's
I
it's
a
a
know that
hot
there's
topic, hot topic.
yeah. So I I loved the inspect tool and everything was found in
Mhm.
it, like the creative, the fatigue and overlap and a bunch of
Audience
stuff.
saturation, all that
Audience
stuff.
saturation. So many people didn't realize that was there. So I even was mentioning it in my training and talked about it all the time, and now it just disappeared within the last few weeks.
Really a
So
few weeks ago. And
yeah,
okay, so this is like really new.
yeah, I'm not
And
not really
I should
happy
be
about it.
listening to your guys' coverage.
Exactly. But
Um,
so what took you then from that to where you are now then?
Yeah, so while I was at Facebook, I was living in the Bay Area, spent just an obscene amount of time in wine country, and then as I was, I really loved the job that I was doing at Facebook at the time, but kind of had this opportunity through the pandemic and then being involved with wineries to go leave and start my own company. And so I left in 2020 and built an e-commerce platform for the wine industry,
Uh,
which was really interesting. And then from that. I mean, I'm a total nerd. Like, I think about I don't know, like algorithms and ranking systems and data science in my sleep.
awesome.
And so a lot of the product that we were building had kind of some of those fundamentals. And we were using GPT actually back in 2021 when it first started
Oh,
coming
wow.
out in our product to kind of help make the entire process of marketing just way easier for the wineries that were using our product. Um, and so, yeah, then through that experience, learned a lot. That was my first kind of big foray into building a software company. We ended up selling the company in the fall of last year. And then uh, kind of through everything that was coming together, it was like, hey, like the AI space is not slowing down. I had seen firsthand so much of the impact that it was going to have on small businesses. And so while I was figuring out what was next, I was like, hey, why don't I start a TikTok channel and just start talking about how AI was evolving? When I started it, like November 1st-ish, no one kind of really cared. Like, I mean, I was getting followers, but like not really in the same kind of pace. But talking about things like, hey, what if you're doing a get ready with me video in the morning and it's actually an AI and not a person? Like, what do you guys think about that? I was posing some of these questions. And then yeah, just like as I kept creating content, of course, ChatGPT coming out was a huge kind of like zeitgeist moment for people starting to care about AI.
Yeah.
Um, it's just actually kind of come together in this like really beautiful way where now I feel like I have an opportunity to just like make AI more accessible to more small businesses, non-technical people, people who maybe aren't in the AI Twitter bubble reading the research papers, kind of space that I find myself in all the time, but who have huge opportunity to apply AI in what they do. And so, yeah, that's what we've been doing.
Glug, glug, glug.
Just so much you said right there. Like, I've got so many questions, I feel like. So, November 1st, you started that account.
Yeah.
And just talk about timing. Oh my God.
And yeah, if
So,
you go back and you look at the videos, there's like you'll just see it's kind of funny to
yeah,
see how the content has like evolved, but also I was talking about AI back then too.
man, oh man. Yeah. Did you have experience with TikTok before that, or did it start November 1st?
I had done a little bit of like wine content in the
Oh, okay.
past, but had never really taken it seriously. So actually, one of the first things is I was like, I'm just gonna commit to posting every day for 30 days and see what happens. That kind of um,
Yeah.
that consistency really matters. But
Well, it's crazy. Yeah. So I started that journey like a month before that. You blew up a little bit more than I did, a lot more than I did. But that is what's so great about your account. Like, this is a super complicated topic, but you break it down these chunks. And so for anyone listening, follow Rachel, not just for that information, but for understanding how to create these short videos about complicated things to make them easier to understand. So it's just really good.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of relevant approaches there for how we kind of have given guidance for people to think about content as well. Just especially if you look at the way John does a lot of his stuff, it's all about kind of taking complex topics and breaking them down. You said something really interesting though about like how AI and like ChatGPT is kind of changed the game a lot, and it does seem like there's this like people realize what AI actually is, even though, of course, as you know better than anybody, it's been in everything we've already been doing. We just haven't had that like direct way to kind of like interface with it. So much like a friend almost, and it seems like that's really changed a lot of the perception of what's possible. And I'm just curious, as someone who's been so close to this and weaving your way through it. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think that that actually has changed anything, and why?
yeah, I mean, it's just been a huge change. I think about it in a couple ways. One is that this isn't an official definition, but I like to think of what we used to think of as AI machine learning was a little bit more like traditional, in the sense where in order to have these systems, you would have to have a huge amount of big data. You would have to have an internal team that understand how to train these models. You'd have to have a huge amount of like compute power. Like it's just a very sophisticated and complex process to actually start using AI in businesses. which is why, companies like Facebook, of course, like have the scale and magnitude to be able to do that. But even if you look at some of like, I remember learning this at some point that so many marketplaces that we use online all the time today, like don't
Mm,
even themselves have very sophisticated like machine learning models internally because it just doesn't make sense for them to have that. So that's like where we used to be with a lot of this technology. And then there's been a ton of innovation. So it's really hard to say like there's like one breakthrough innovation, but I think one of the big ones is these generative AI models, which just by the nature of how they work, where you can train a model on how to generate language, which is what like ChatGPT is, like how to generate text. And then you can package that up and let other people use it. Like that concept is quite new, and that's what's made it really accessible. And then on top of that, you have ChatGPT, which is just a really easy, approachable interface for,
mm.
kind of more the mainstream consumer. It's just kind of these like building blocks, if you will, that have made it so like now AI is actually kind of like a mainstream utility versus in the past, you used to really have to have quite a big organization to get started.
Cheers. So take me back a little bit. So sounds like when you started that last business is when you kind of fell in love with the ChatGPT and the AI. It was ChatGPT itself that you were still using, that you're using actually in 2021?
It was GPT-3.
That
So
makes sense. Okay.
yeah, because like ChatGPT is basically this like application layer on top of GPT-3 that they've like fine-tuned or trained to make it much better at chatting. So you can like go in and have it
Right.
feel like a conversation. Yeah.
So give me an idea then, give us an idea of the various ways you're using it that made you realize like this aha moment that this is so powerful and it's something that you want to keep working with. So like what kind of things were you automating? What were you doing?
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know if I'd imagine you guys have played around with tools like Copy AI or Jasper.
A little bit.
Um, so those were some of the early kind of like consumer facing products that we're using GPT-3. And we were serving wineries, which people think of wineries as being this very, romanticized type of business. But in reality, when you're a winemaker, you spend your time in the vineyard and in the cellar. You don't want to spend your time
Mm,
like thinking about marketing. You don't want to spend your time like building a website, even like listing your wines online. So we would have all these like challenges where there's just so much like manual work around content. And so kind of from seeing the technology come out and then seeing those tools, we're like, hey, why don't we build some features into our product that just helped our customers generate some of that marketing content in a much easier way. And one of the best features that we built was like AI generated marketing emails where
mm,
it would take in, like what types of wines the winery was selling, where the winery was located. It had enough context about harvest to talk about like a harvest update in context of Pinot Noir being a thin skinned grape. Like it was mind blowing, right? Like how good it was.
hmm.
Um, and so yeah, that was like just and once you start with one thing, you get inspired. You're like, oh, well, what if we use GPT to do this next thing and next thing? Um, and then yeah, like outside of that, I think some of the things that still excite me a lot, and I had thought about a lot back in like November, October, like time frame. It's just like these models can help you brainstorm or reason
Hmm.
or like just think through things like a totally different way. And I feel like that's still like a super underexplored space too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's for me, that's the primary way I use ChatGPT right now. Like I still haven't really gotten into the playground, but just asking it questions, trying to get some ideas for like titles, for example, just for like I'm putting together a training right now, and I asked like I submitted like my initial list, like give me some more examples, some more ideas. So it's things like that. But where I'm really stuck is on where it gets more advanced and it's
Hmm.
integrating with the API, and I'm just starting to realize like how powerful that is once you start integrating with the API, and that's the part where my brain doesn't really latch onto how you do all that. So, what are some of these more advanced things that you can do once you're integrated with the API? You mentioned, email marketing. What are some other things you could do with that?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think about any of the mundane manual tasks you have. You can probably get AI to help you start doing that today. Or another way to think about it is like if you could train an intern to do it, you can probably train AI to do it. Someone who doesn't have much experience. And so like one of the ways, we use AI right now is we have our own kind of like automation process set up, for example, to like triage our email inbox. Because a huge part of our community is people being able to like ask us questions and we try to, respond, provide guides and resources all the time. So that creates a huge volume of emails. So we have AI helping us kind of tag, triage, and even draft those responses. And that's just like crazy, right? That like I
Yes.
could I could take AI, plug it in via API to an automation tool, and then all of a sudden I have like, something like writing emails for me in my tone.
And I am really bad at answering emails. This sounds awesome. So how do you do that though? How does that integrate? So is it like integrate with Google Mail or something? I mean, I'm going to sound really ignorant by asking these questions, but how do you
No,
do
no,
that?
no. Yeah, I mean you can really like when you learn the automation side, and I actually wasn't really big into automations before. I felt like, oh, it was like useful for some things, but a lot of times I felt like, oh, the effort to go set up an automation kind of outweighed the effort to just do the task. Like, so I never had really seen that value. But then now that you can plug AI into automations, it's just like, oh my gosh, like you can automate so much more like complex things. So I've like really, really gotten on the automation train.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, like like how we have it set up, we use Help Scout, which is like one of the email inbox management systems for like customer support. Usually it's kind of similar like Intercom. And then you just, start plugging these tools together. You can use like Zapier as one
Hmm.
example of an automation tool. We use Make a lot. It's like our preferred tool, but they're really the interfaces are pretty manageable once you start to learn it. 'Cause then you just think about, hey, step one, you get an email from your customer support thing. Now, step two, let's send that email to OpenAI via API and ask it, what is this email about? Write us some bullet points and give us a subject or like a tag. Okay, then based on if it's about refunds or about shipping or whatever if you're an e-commerce brand, whatever the use case is, you can kind of branch out your process. And then all of a sudden, once you map all that stuff out, then you have this system that's just kind of like helping you and doing this like work for you. It's pretty incredible.
Cheers.
No, I was just gonna say, I think one thing that so everything you're saying there is like that's the kind of stuff I love. Like, because similar to you, I have like I was kind of like a marketer who decided to try to do the coding thing. And I found kind of a niche there because like if you can learn enough to be dangerous, you can be really dangerous in a lot of cases, especially once you start
Mhm.
getting comfortable with some of the tech like you're describing, even just kind of like setting up these flows and thinking through the use cases. But one of the really cool, exciting things about kind of what you're describing too is like a lot of these solutions are low or no code, right?
Mhm.
As like it's like you don't necessarily have to know all of that, but of course, if you know some of it, especially if something's breaking or not working exactly the way you think it should, then it helps you kind of troubleshoot it. But I think like not to like change themes too much, but one of the things that kind of brings out for me is like not really being afraid of it because there's still an opportunity for people in there and for people to really think about creative and useful applications. It's not like you do it and it's done. There's always going to be more work to do, right? So like we improve these processes, things get better. Something else is going to be available for us to improve or work on. And I think that what you're describing is like exactly the kind of thing that I think is really powerful that it's hard for people to really know how powerful it is until they go through one of the use cases like what you're saying. It's like, think about, oh, what's something you're spending a lot of time on and it's like driving you crazy or it's really frustrating. That's usually a really good place to start, right?
Yeah, 1,000%. I feel like, I mean, like AI is this huge potential step change for a lot of businesses and work, but it is so far away from like actual human capability still. Like to be clear, right, too. So it's like, I think people having this mindset of like, okay, how do I just use this to automate the boring stuff that I don't like doing? Or like, man, imagine if you never had to respond to an email again. Like, wouldn't we all just be like happier? You know? Um, so I think you have totally the right mindset there.
Yeah, one of my favorite like early AI things that I started using was this thing is called I think it was called Amy, and it was a calendar scheduling assistant. So like you could copy it on your response to someone and say, Amy, help me set up a meeting next week, find a time with this person, and it would correspond with the person. And they even had trained it so that it would like delay before it sent emails to people. And I would always say in my emails to people, this is my AI assistant, it's not real. And people would still like talk to it like it was real. And then they'd even later say, like, I guess I had people who just skipped over that part of the email. They'd say, your assistant's so friendly. It's like they didn't realize it was like an AI system. And to your point about like, okay, they're not quite there, but it's interesting to see these different use cases that come out where if it's a very specific use case, they can make things feel very real, right? And I think that that's kind of another interesting layer as we're starting to see some of these systems come out is like what's the degree of specialization, like here's an AI that does just this, whereas you have more of like a generalist AI, which I think is kind of the way people are thinking about ChatGPT right now, is like it's this generalist AI for text essentially, even though it can do all these other things too. And I just wonder like how you think about that layer in terms of like specialization versus generalist AI, and even how you might categorize that in some of your materials on the AI exchange.
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. I guess there's like two sides of it, probably. One is kind of speaking about like the breakthroughs of what we have right now. One of the reasons why, from like my intuition, people I've talked to, is one of the reasons why GPT is so powerful is because it is multidisciplinary, right? Like it actually just kind of like understands much broader set of problems than like we've ever had systems before, which is like kind of crazy because it's like kind of how humans, like, smart people, we're like, okay, you have a varied set of experiences. Um, but that being said, like just a generic thing isn't gonna always be like the best at something, right? So it's actually really similar to people also, where like you need generalists and you need specialists. What I'm really excited about is, there's a huge new wave of software companies that are being built right now, and existing software companies that are kind of like rethinking their strategies, but everything being very like AI native. So like how would we design a workflow, or how do we design like do you even have to make your own ads anymore? Right? And I'm not saying in like a over aggrandized sense, but just a like what if like how creative teams delegate to each other, you could now delegate to an AI where like everyone is kind of the creative director, right? Instead of the creative executor, or you have someone come in and do the final touches to really get that piece of creative to be its like best performant. All of that, those questions and just like that rethinking is like all going on like literally right now. And so I feel like 6 to 12 to 18 months from now, we're just going to have like an entirely new landscape of the tools that we use, which will be really cool.
Cheers. It's cool. It's exciting. It's a little overwhelming and maybe even scary to some of us, right? Especially if we haven't been following this stuff all that closely. I mean, we think about it and everything you mentioned there, like so Jasper AI and other kind of copywriting tools, and then you have video creation AI and image creation AI, and so much of that process could then be helped with AI. And I think what we kind of alluded to this a moment ago about where it is now. Like, there's not really anything to be worried about it being smarter than people, but we know that's going to get better and better. The probably the main thing I hear from people who are skeptics of it or are scared of it, or they're afraid of being replaced.
Mhm.
Um, I'm sure you hear a lot of that stuff too. I mean, how do you, especially as you look a year, 2 years down the road? I mean, what do you think about that concern?
I mean, I guess I'm just an optimist that humans always figure stuff out. And I think it like while it's really exciting, I think it's also not going to happen as fast as the people who are worried about how fast it's going to happen is going to happen, if that makes sense. Like,
Mhm.
if you were really to take what AI or ChatGPT generates the first time around and put that in like an email every single time, like you're going to send a lot of really bad emails.
Hmm.
Like there's just still we still have such a gap. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've been kind of exploring this question a lot personally too, and thinking about as I'm building my business, what role does AI have in the business? What role does growing a team have? How do you balance those two? It's like really interesting. I'm like, you know what? It sounds pretty nice to like be able to do the same amount but just work less, right? Or maybe you still have the same size of teams. Why do you need to work 40 hours a week? Or who am I kidding? I don't work 40 hours. I probably work like way more, right? Wouldn't it be nice to actually just work 40 hours? And so I think like having kind of that lens when you're looking at this technology is important.
Yeah. And I kind of wonder how long, and I'm sure this is probably happening already, but how long before a very optimistic entrepreneur goes and creates their own AI team, to basically do all of these different tasks
I mean,
that,
that kind of exists, doesn't it?
right.
But
But it's almost like how long before people like you two are then the AI entrepreneur telling everybody how to be the AI entrepreneur and giving people like guidance on the model, and maybe that's already kind of like what you're thinking about. I don't know, but it does seem like there's this, if you look at like the positive optimistic side, there's a lot of opportunity there. I think there's still a lot of opportunity for bad stuff too, and we talked about this on our last podcast about, well, yeah, that's very easy. You could be your entrepreneur. You could be also be an entrepreneur fisher or hacker that has your AI team that's supporting everything you're doing and making all of your robocalls and sending all of your emails and responding to everybody and grabbing their data. So yeah, it can go both ways, but I do think that there's this really interesting future that is, it feels pretty near. But you also said something really interesting that I wasn't expecting you to say, where you said it's maybe a little further away than some of us think. And so as someone who's pretty close to that, I was kind of expecting you to say like, oh, it'll be here before you know it, or it's already here. So I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that perception.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think it's kind of both. And I think everybody almost has both perspectives kind of in their brain too, right? Like you can make anybody can make an argument for like, okay, AI is gonna change every single aspect of how I work in the next 6 months, or it's probably gonna take like 5, 10, 20 years. Um, I mean, I've been studying like the internet a lot. I've been thinking a lot about how there's still so many businesses that do so much of their bookkeeping pen and paper. And thinking about the value of human connection and interaction. Like, how do you model decision making? What types of things you just not trust an AI to do? Like, would you trust AI to do your taxes? Like, it's a really interesting question because, like, taxes are like something a lot of people don't like doing, but then also there's like a pretty big consequence if you don't do your taxes
Mhm.
right in some cases, right? So yeah, I think it's like really hard to have like a general perspective. But for anybody who's like concerned about how quickly it's moving, my best advice is just like pay attention and like be part of the wave and chill out a little bit because it's like it's not going to happen like tomorrow. Um, But yeah, we're also still so early. I think that's another thing that is really fascinating for anybody who has been like building AI products or has been in kind of that uh, side of this bubble is like it's just crazy that the mainstream consumer public knows this much and cares this much about a new technology like this as early as we're at. Like that's just part of that is also wild.
Cheers. So what haven't you automated yet that you want to automate?
We are building out kind of like a co-pilot for all of our content creation. So back to like, I don't think AI can create better content than I can. I've
Right.
like tried, right? And I'm like, nah, okay, like maybe I'm just not a good enough prompter, right? But like, I just actually think that technology is like not close to being there yet. But there are a lot of pieces around kind of like thinking about putting together content or repurposing content that we're trying to use AI for right now. And that's been really fun.
So you talked about it's not as good of a writer as you yet. Have you, and I'm sure you've gone through all those steps of like trying to train it, right? To try to train it to have your voice. Have you done that?
We
So
have, yeah.
can you explain that process? Because that's something that, like, at least with ChatGPT, I've tried to do. Like, I've fed it, my blog posts and like, learn my style and this and that. And I feel like kind of like what you're saying. I never really get what I'm hoping to get in return. Like, okay, now write a blog post in this style. Maybe I'm missing something. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're also still, uh, I guess, just like really early in figuring out how a
Yeah.
lot of that works. But some of the ways that you can get from kind of the generic responses with ChatGPT to a more customized response is one, actually just like spending the time getting good at prompting. Like I kind of think of it as the first time we all like had to go to fully remote work world and you realize like, man, it really like stinks to be on Zoom like 24/7. You can't really like get on Zoom for every single thing you're trying to like tell someone. You had to kind of like learn to be like extremely articulate
Mm.
over like written text. It's kind of that like same just like new muscle I feel like that we're learning. And then you can actually fine tune these models, which is something that's like a bit more of an advanced concept. But even that right now, like either like the research is still really early on how to get that to work really, really well for most use cases, or there's even a possibility that that's not even like the right approach for using AI in a more like custom way. When I say we're early, I mean there are literally research papers being drafted right now of like this approach didn't work, this approach didn't work, this approach didn't work. Or maybe someone will be like, this approach actually worked, and then that will uh, and that's a lot of the stuff that we share. I literally spend a lot of time just reading these research papers so people don't have to. But
And you write all that that's not written by AI?
No, I do use AI to help me like skim them sometimes, and I've posted there's a tool I love using. It's called Explain Paper,
Hmm.
which some of these papers are like 20, 30 pages of like really dense stuff, and you're like, okay, cool. Was this a break? Was this like worth reading? And like, what was the general approach? So I'll use it for that.
Explain paper, you said.
Yeah.
Explain Paper,
All right,
yeah,
I'm gonna check that one out. I hadn't seen that one before. It's probably, is it on the AI exchange?
it is,
All
yeah.
right, well, of course it is. That's good.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned three tools now that I know I need to check out. Like Make was
Yeah.
another one. So Make, you said, is like a replacement for Zapier or Zapier. I don't know
Mhm.
how we're supposed to
Yeah.
pronounce it.
Maybe part of it is I don't know how to say Zapier, so I just can't use the tool. I'm just
I
kidding.
don't think any of us know how to say that one. We've always,
No.
yeah, I've heard it pronounced different times every time everybody says it.
Well, it would make sense if it's Zapier because you make zaps,
Right.
right?
I've heard your justification on that before.
Cheers. So you had mentioned, Rachel, talking about how to prompt ChatGPT or GPT, and I think that's something I've learned from you too, the importance of prompt engineering. And this is something I feel like anyone can start to make better use of that ChatGPT tool. if they become a good prompt engineer, as opposed to like just putting a question and they look at the response and like, oh, that's not good enough. That's not what I asked for. That's low quality or whatever. It's all about being a
Mhm.
prompt engineer. What goes into being a good prompt engineer?
Yeah. Man, I feel like this is gonna be like the catchphrase of the conversation. Like, we're still so early. No, but I mean, I actually think you're very much right on the quality of the prompt or the question or the instructions that you're giving these systems really, really does impact the result. And even as I've spoken to people, I love when someone says, I use ChatGPT and I just don't really get it. Because I'm like, oh, tell me, what did you try?
Mhm.
And the really common thread amongst that camp of people is that usually they have asked ChatGPT to help them with something very generic. So they'll say, like, write me a marketing email about a shoe wear brand. And it's like, okay, then you're going to get a generic shoe wear brand email. But if you're like, if you start describing more of your task and you're more specific, you set the context well of like, what does your shoe wear brand care about? And you can even say like what your goals are, right? Is your goal to build more loyalty with your audience? Is your goal to convert them on this sale you're having? Like, just the more specific you get, the more likely your response is going to be better. So that's just like a general concept. Then there's a lot of kind of emerging research on like a little bit peeling back the onion of how do we help the AI model find the best parts of uh, what it's learned from, but more specifically, like the patterns it's learned to get good responses. So if you've seen the really popular prompt approach of saying, act as an expert
Mhm.
marketer, that's why that's the theory, at least right now, the leading theory of like that's why that works is because it's kind of like activating that part of the patterns that the model has learned from the data it's been trained on, which can be helpful just as you're I think if I were to zoom out and say, like, when you're using these tools, the kind of bizarre mindset shift to have, if you can, is like, hey, they're actually not like AI is not actually thinking. It's not actually really understanding what you're saying. It's just taking the words that you gave it and predicting what's most likely to come next. And when you say act as an expert marketer, you're kind of like giving it better context to then go predict from. And so you're going to get kind of better responses. But I still think we're so early in like what makes a good prompt engineer. Probably be asking in like 6 months, like what's the best advice for this? I'll be like, all right, here's the new things, that we figured out.
Yeah, I saw you talking about that in a TikTok video. That whole thing about like we don't really understand like what it's actually doing there, which I thought was like really cool because I know one of the things we talk a lot about in the ML world is like this whole thing about like the black boxiness of like at some point we don't really understand what it's doing because especially if you have like unsupervised learning models and all this, and you'll explain this way better than I ever would, and if I'm saying anything wrong, please correct it. But it's basically like at some point we don't really know how or why it's doing what it's doing. But I think like you explaining that thing about like the act as an expert marketer, the way that I conceptualized it after you kind of went through that in your TikTok video was like almost thinking about it as like in our brains, we have different parts of our brains do different things, right? So some about emotion, sight, taste, whatever. And so you're almost like telling it what part of the brain to go to when you're telling
Mhm.
it like act as an expert marketer. It goes to that place where it's got all of this stuff sort of related to what does an expert marketer actually look like. Now there might be connections across other parts of the brain, but that it's using that as like it's way it's like it's its subway route, right? It's like shooting all through the network based on sort of that prompt. And I don't know if that makes any sense at all, and I'm not really sure if that like helps. But in case it helps anybody else, just when you described it, that's the way I was thinking about it. Because up until I watched your video, I was thinking, oh, it knows how to respond as an expert marketer would. But the way you explained it is like, no, you're kind of telling it sort of what to target. It's like
Mhm.
what to think, what to think about in a way. But I know you kind of mentioned also in your video that's like the nerdy thing. But can you talk about that a little bit? I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think your kind of depiction of it is like a really good way to think about it, of at least how some really, really smart people are starting to conceptualize like what's actually happening when we prompt in these ways. Um, the example that I loved was there's a really clear example of AI or like GPT being better at translating from English to French when you say, you're a masterful, or below is a transcript of a masterful French translator who was given the phrase blank and then has translated into blank, right? And like what's nice about the way that these like AI researchers are studying these models is they have all these like techniques, right? To be like, you know, for a fact that this English phrase equals this French phrase. And so you can actually have like a data set of all those phrases. And then you can say, okay, well, if we just say like translate this English to French, we can see how many times it was correct. And then, but if we do say like, imagine you're a masterful translator, then you can have the English phrase and the French phrase, and you can see how many times that's correct. What they found is like that second one performs better. So like they're starting to do all these like really smart ways to research like what's actually happening, right? And then once they have a breakthrough, they're like, okay, now how do we like conceptualize or explain this black box? But um yeah, it's like incredibly fascinating. So and I think maybe like another thing for anybody who's listening, it's like, oh, I'm not an AI researcher, like maybe I have no business in like doing prompt engineering and all that stuff. It's like, actually, I 1,000% disagree with that, because right now we only have the perspective of the people that are doing this research like to date. And one thing that's like super cool is you never know what you're going to find in ChatGPT that works way better, right? And so like just the fact that more people are experimenting with it with different like experiences, diverse perspectives, more creative approaches. I feel like we're also going to maybe like see some crazy breakthroughs from, maybe from one of you guys.
Maybe instead of prompt engineers, we can have like prompt miners, right? It's like you're like
Right.
Yeah.
mining for the best way to find something. In fact, another thing you posted was also like, wasn't there a prompt engineer job that you
Hmm.
had seen? And it was like the first example. I thought that was pretty fascinating too.
Yeah, I've been waiting for that to set up like alerts on Indeed. And it'd be like, tell me when the jobs come out that are like prompt engineering and GPT and stuff. That one I actually found that someone like tweeted it and everything. But I think that's going to be also really interesting to watch how those jobs evolve.
Bottoms up.
I have it's not to go too far back, but John, can I ask a quick question
Yeah. Go.
about your usage? And this is another thing you've kind of made some content on. I thought it was kind of interesting. So going back to the theme of low no code options, you had
Mhm.
some of these Google Sheet integrations, which I'm a big like Google Sheet, and I use Looker Studio and all that and connect everything, and I love it. It's all fun stuff. But it's sort of related to also what people are just kind of like telling all of their secrets and all of their
Mm.
business intel and passing all of that to Chat GPT, whether that's through these Google Sheets integrations or directly through the Chat GPT interface or OpenAI API, whatever it may be. I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts on is that a good idea? I mean, should we be concerned about that? Like, I know you're not an attorney, of course, but I am kind of surprised at some of the examples people share. I'm like, I can't believe you actually, number one, passed that to ChatGPT, but now you're posting a screenshot of what you said on like, social media or whatever it may be.
Yeah. I mean, I generally think that being a conscious consumer online about the data that you're sharing is like super important. We've actually looked into this a little bit just because we've gotten a lot of questions around it. So, ChatGPT, they've been very explicit that they are using the questions you're putting in and the responses you're getting out to help both the team understand how people are using a system like this, and then second, to feed it back to the AI model to improve it. And so that's just like super important to understand if anybody's using it, just be aware that your data is being shared in that way. And then usage of the API or GPT-3, which is again that model that actually powers ChatGPT. Um, it's so they've set that up to be a lot more kind of like commercial or production ready in terms of its usage. They have like really clear terms of service that like you own the input, you own the output. They say we will look at occasionally responses to figure out how to improve it, but then you can actually opt out. They have a way in their terms of service so you can go and request that. And so I think like with anybody that's using these systems, it's like just really important that if you are going to use it for something that you would be concerned about a company having access to, like you should do the work yourself, talk to your attorneys and figure out like, okay, what are the boundaries we should be respecting here?
There's so much hype here that, I mean, if you're going to be a bad player, like you're going to
Mhm.
focus on this because they're so hungry for stuff. And I think that it's also, I mean, we talked about some of the risks of misinformation being driven by some of these tools, but I've seen so much misinformation around what ChatGPT even is. Like, does it cost money yet? When's it going to? Like, I've seen so many wrong things, people sharing on that. And they're like, oh, it's no longer free. You have to pay today. And it's like, of course that's not it's just people are missing all of this context. And it's like it's kind of great that it's as democratized as it is, but it's also like it's just a minefield. So that's just a plug also for folks like yourself who are helping other people really navigate this, because it is not something that I think the common folk that are kind of out here working in the space even are really we should be trusting ourselves to kind of know everything that's up. And people will just they just sign right up for these things. It's crazy to me. But
Yeah.
anyway, that's my soapbox on that.
I mean, we spend days at a time researching stuff before we're posting that. Like we take that, of course, like there's always a risk that we don't have like the full picture or don't have full information. So I always recommend people like, do your own legwork as well. But yeah, it's just like a really important time to be a mindful consumer in the space. The other thing that's super different, right? If we like compare this to the evolution of the internet, like we didn't have the internet to talk about the internet when the internet became a thing. But now we have the internet to talk about AI, right? And so I think just like the pace at which information is spreading, or gets shared about this is quite like different than we've ever had before with a, technology shift that's like this big.
Last call. I feel like we could talk to you all day, Rachel. There's just one more thing I want to make sure I asked you regarding the playground, because that seems like it's the next step from just using the main interface. I
Yes.
don't completely get it. Could you kind of explain what the playground is and why we should use that?
Yeah, so my best advice for anybody who is like, cool, I've been using ChatGPT, I want to really start using this seriously in my business, is to go learn the playground, which you can access by going to beta.openai.com/playground. You need to create an account with OpenAI if you don't already have it. It does cost money, so you need to like put in, I think, payment information, and then they give you $18-ish of free credits, which is like probably hundreds of requests. So you do have like enough to play with, to go and get started. But what it does when you go to the playground is you get direct access to the model, the AI model that powers ChatGPT, like the actual kind of core of it, which is called GPT-3. And It is slightly different. So like the difference between the two, right, is like ChatGPT was you took that core model and then you made it really, really good at chatting with people or dialogue. And so when people get into the playground, they'll notice immediately it's a little bit less of a conversational interface. In fact, it's like just a box. And you just write your prompt and then you click submit and then it generates the response. But once you start getting familiar with the playground and that way to interact with these AI models, then you can take that and use it in an API in like any tool that you're using that has an API, connection. We talked about automation tools a lot through this conversation, and that's really where like the creme de la creme like ways to use AI starts kind of coming to fruition. A good example is like if you go in there, if you go into ChatGPT and you ask it to maybe like, um, uh, a really simple question where you'd expect a one-word answer, right? You get these like huge verbose answers, and like
Hmm.
that's because it was trained to be good at chat. But then when you go to OpenAI, the playground directly, you ask it that same question, you'll get just your answer. So you just start to see like it's like a much more like vanilla, like just basic like version where you can then start building on top of it. So highly, highly recommend playing around with it.
Awesome.
So
Luca, you got
that's the
anything
homework
else?
for today's
Yeah, yeah.
podcast is go use, because last time we said go use ChatGPT. So
Hmm.
now it's going to be go use the OpenAI Playground, which I think it's a great takeaway.
Absolutely. Well, Rachel, thanks so much for joining us and helping us make sense of AI and ChatGPT and telling us it's still early and not to be afraid of it. Because it's overwhelming for most of us who are it's just been what, a month and a half, 2 months or whatever that most of us have jumped into it. But for those of you who want to stay up to date on this stuff, follow Rachel. It's the underscore Rachel underscore Woods on TikTok, right? Or is
I
that
think it
wrong?
might be the period, Rachel.
Oh, the
Yeah,
period.
I
period
think
instead of
so.
Ah,
underscore.
Yeah, I think I'm
my bad.
underscore on Twitter,
Fair.
and yeah,
I
but
also just searched Rachel Woods AI on TikTok and you come up. So
Yeah,
that's another
just
way to do
search
it if you don't
I
want
think I'm
to.
the only Rachel Woods talking about AI for now.
for now. There are a bunch of Rachel Woods out there otherwise though.
There's a ton.
But but and then the AI exchange.com, great newsletter. I mean, where can people find you in general?
Yeah, I always like to point people to our newsletter. That's really where we try to curate and consolidate the highest value stuff, especially if you don't want to be a nerd that has to read all the research papers and you just want to know what's really useful and we should start thinking about to apply AI in your work, then the newsletter is the best place to go.
Awesome. Uh, Luke, you put this question in there. I'm going to ask it. So
Oh yeah.
if you had an AI personal assistant, Rachel, what would you name it?
What would I name it? Um, I like Amy. That's kind of a funny. I don't mean to like steal that company's branding, but I'm like, man, yeah, that's a good one. Maybe
Awesome.
we'll stick with that.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having
Uh,
me.
you bet. Until next time, everybody, do awesome things. I'm out.